So yeah, this is a topic that I've kind of talked about a little bit in the past. It's a topic I find really interesting is the kinds of chord voicings that only crop up in certain kinds of music. I've talked in previous videos about how you can use Django Reinhardt style chords um, in the Celtic modes, Ionian, Dorian, Mixed Lydian and Aeolian. I've talked quite a bit about how you can particularly use Django style chords to get a kind of gypsy jazz sound in the Dorian mode. That is a lot of fun. But in today's video I want to talk about how you can borrow the kinds of chord voicings that make genres like bossa nova, South American jazz, Latin jazz kind of chord voicings, and how you can take the sound of those kind of very specific chord flavours that are popular in those kinds of music and incorporate them into your Celtic backing to give it a more kind of sunny aspect. Particularly good now that we're getting into the winter and it's getting cold. Oh, hey Matteo, thank you for tuning in. I hope you're good over there. So yeah, there's certain common, very, very common chord voicings. There's one progression in particular which crops up in hundreds of Latin tunes. It's in loads of bossa nova tunes. So I'll just play it for you in the key of D. It sounds something like this. It's the beginning of tall and tanned and young and so lovely. The girl from Ipanema goes walking. Everyone she passes goes, ah. You know that one. It's also the beginning of Un Pato and loads of classics. I've talked about that progression a little bit in the past, but let's just have a little look at what the chords are in that. Basically, it's some chords in the key of D major. You've got D major, effectively, we'll ignore the D9 for a second, I'll come back to that one, but then effectively E minor, because you've got a kind of E minor 9 chord, and then your A13 chord, that's replacing an A7 chord. So basically the chords are D, 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 E, 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 E minor, A, D, D, D. So with the exception of the E there, which quickly changes to an E minor, you've got D, E minor and A. So those are all chords that you could get away with playing along with a folk tune in the key of D. What happens a lot in bossa nova though is that they deliberately use these very vague chord voicings. The reason that they do that is because one of the kind of trademark things of that style of music was that the vocal melody will very often just switch scales in the middle of a song. There's all these kind of momentary key changes, and they deliberately keep the harmony vague in order to facilitate that, so you can kind of get away with messing around with which scale you're using when your chord voicing isn't very definitely fulfilling a certain function. So if I play D major, that's very clear. It's got a root note, it's got a fifth, which is just kind of backing up the root and making it very clear in your ear what that root is. So if I play the root and the fifth together, you get a very clear sense of do, that's the root. That one. Do. And then the third, up there at the top, the third in a chord just tells you if the chord is minor or major, so if it's a happy chord or a sad chord, pretty much. So my third in this case is telling me major third, happy chord. In my bossa version, however, we're going to use this, much softer, and this is a 6-9 chord. So what you've got here is a root, a third, then a sixth, so the sixth note from a D major scale, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, and then up at the top the ninth note from the D major scale, which is E. So this gives you this very soft kind of chord. It's much less strident than the standard D major. And it's also, because it's only got one root and a third, but then two other notes instead of the fifth, which backs up the root, and instead of any more roots, it's got a much vaguer, fuzzier sort of quality to it. And that's kind of one of the trademarks of bossa nova, and it also can kind of fuzz up your folk backing if you're creative with it. So that's the first chord I want to talk about, which is D9, and if you click the link in the chat there that I've put there, you can find a little link to the shape for that. It's basically a little mini bar on the 4th fret, and then two other fingers. Your middle finger goes on the A string 5th fret, and your third finger goes on the 5th fret of the B string. And you can leave the open E string in it if you want to as well, but not the bottom one, because that'll make it sound horrible. Yeah. So that's your D9 chord. The next chord in the progression is an E9 chord. We're going to ignore that one for the time being. That is one of these kind of momentary modulations of key, which I talked about. That's a step too technical for folk backing. We're going to ignore it for now. So let's have a look at the next chord, which is E minor 9. Lovely atmospheric kind of chord. So for this chord, you've got this shape, which is also on that blog link there. And effectively, when you're talking about folk backing, if you want to add numbers to your chords, add these kind of jazzy extensions, there are some simple rules for it. Within a major key, you probably know by now that chord 1 and 4 and 5 are always major chords, and 2 and 3 and 6 are always minor chords. And the next level of complication on top of that is to add in the sevenths to make your triads, 3-note chords, into 4-note chords, tetrads. So what you end up with when you do that is a set of chords. You've got 1 is a major 7 chord, 4 is a major 7 chord, 5 has to be the dominant 7, which is like the major 7 chord, except that the 7th note is flattened by a semitone. And the reason that is because the notes that you're using to build these chords are the notes of your major scale for the key that you're in. So if we think about D major as an example, you've got D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and those are your options. So the 5th chord starts on A, and the notes are going to be A, B is missed, C sharp, D, E, so A, C sharp and E, that's your kind of A major bass, and then G is going to be your 7th note. If you were playing an A major scale, it would be a G sharp, but it's not. It's got to be G because there's no G sharp in the key of D. And so your 5th chord ends up with this flattened 7th note, and that's what makes it a dominant 7 chord. But basically what you need to remember is that if you're in a major key, chords 1 and 4 are major 7s if you're adding these jazzy chords. Chord 5 is a dominant 7th, so it's got a flattened 7th note in it. And then 2, 3 and 6 are all going to be minor 7 chords. And that means that within the key of D, you could play D major 7, E minor 7, F sharp minor 7, G major 7, A7, not A major 7, that sounds completely wrong if you play it, but A7, so that's your dominant 7th chord with the flattened 7th note in it, and then B minor 7, and that's your last one. You can play it like that. So those are the kind of standard tetrads that you could use, and that formula applies to any major key. So 1 and 4 major 7 chords, chord 5 is always a dominant 7 chord, 2, 3 and 6 always minor 7 chords. When you're adding these kind of numbers to this then, you can add any numbers that you want to any of these chords, so long as the extra notes that you add are also notes from within the scale. And actually there are some contexts which I'll come back to when you can add other notes as well. So what that means is, for the key of D major, which we'll talk about first, to begin with, if I want to play a D major 9, what I'm playing there is the root, the third, the fifth, the major 7th, and then the 9th. If you think about a scale, well, the 8th note is the first note that you played again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's your 8th note. It's D again. So the 9th is actually the same thing as the second note, and the reason that people call it the 9th and not the second, which I always found immensely confusing, is because you play that note an octave above the D, because if you play D and the adjacent E together, it sounds horrible. So you don't do that, you play that note up an octave and then it sounds quite nice. So it's fine for me to add an extra 9th to my D major 7 chord, because E is a note which is in the scale of D. So it just acts as kind of flavouring for that chord, and it changes the feel of that chord, and in this case it makes it into a very vague, floaty, soft, gentle cloud sort of chord. And that's my D6-9 chord, where I've got the first, the third, the 6th, and the 9th. So if I was playing along with a folk tune, and it was a kind of vague, fuzzy, warm-sounding kind of folk tune, in the key of D major, then using that as my chord 1 would be quite a nice option. Let's have a look at the next stock bossa nova progression chord. So instead of E minor, I could use this, and this is an E minor 9. I use this chord for a lot of things. I'll show you some of the other things, but it's particularly nice as a chord 2 in E minor because it's got the open strings at either end, and that gives it this big kind of booming quality, and then it resolves really nicely to the next one we're going to look at, and then back to the start. So it's a great kind of atmosphere builder. But yeah, so to make this chord, you want your middle finger on the 7th fret of the A string, like that, then your index finger on the 5th fret of the D string, and then your ring finger or 3rd finger on the 7th fret of the G string, and your little finger on the 7th fret of the B string, and then you play all the strings and it goes wong. I often say you should kind of be able to feel what a certain chord voicing feels like. This chord just feels like it goes wong in my mind when I play an E9, E minor 9 rather. So yeah, we could use this as chord 2 in the key of D minor, and that would be very nice. I'll come back to some things you can do for the other ones in a minute, but the ones from the classic bossa progression, the next one is our chord 5, and we're going to use A13, which is like this. So you've got your index finger on the 5th fret of the E string, you've got your A string left open because another A at the bottom of your chord, that's the root note, so it can't hurt anybody. Then you've got your middle finger on the 5th fret there, 5th fret of the D string, ring finger on the 6th fret of the G string, and your index finger on the 7th fret of the B string, and that gives you this really nice A13 chord. And if you want to, you can flatten your index finger and get an extra nice 9th at the top for extra jazzy. So that's that one. With the A13 chord, this complies with my rule I was talking about before about which numbers you can add, because what we've got at the bottom here as our bass is an A7 chord. So we've got the root, which is A, we've got the flattened 7th there under our middle finger, that is G, and you've got the major 3rd there, which is telling you it's a major type chord, but the flattened 7th is telling you it's a dominant chord. So those together give you your A7 chord. and then you're adding, with your little finger, you're adding the 13th there, and if you flatten it, you're adding the 9th as well. Now that 13th and the 9th there, the notes that they are, A's 13th is F sharp. F sharp is perfectly fine for the key of D major because F sharp is in the scale of D, so adding that isn't going to hurt anybody. And likewise, the 9th in the key of A is B, because B is the second note of A's scale. And again, B is perfectly fine in the key of D major. So adding those notes to your chord is going to give you an extra jazzy flavoured chord. It's not going to offend anybody because there's nothing that clashes with the key signature of D. So you're all good. So yeah, I'll whistle a tune in the key of D major. I'll whistle Kafunken Jig, which I use a lot as an example. And I'm going to play along with it using these 3 chords and nothing else. So it would go something like... something like that. So you get this very nice kind of soft feel to it. You might want to end it on a more definite D chord, or potentially begin it on a more definite D chord, because coming back to D6/9 in the context of folk music maybe sounds a little bit unresolved. That is a nice thing that you can do. There's a few other things I want to tell you about as well. With that 6/9 voicing that we started with, there is the way that you play it if the root note is on the A string. That's diagrammed in the link there. Here is another way that you can play it. If you take that shape that we had and you flatten the ring finger so that it's covering the top string, and then you kind of flatten the middle finger as well slightly so that it's now covering the D string as well as the A string, and now hook your thumb around the back so it's holding down the G note on the 3rd fret of the bottom string. That gives you G6/9, and this shape is also movable, and it's whatever note your thumb is holding down, that'll be your root note. I suddenly realised I haven't actually included that one on the diagram, so let me just add it very quickly. I'll stick it on at the end. So this is another 6/9 chord, and the 6/9 is very kind of characteristic of Latin jazz, also beloved of Django Reinhardt. So if you're in the key of D major, you can use that for your 4 chord. So you can do things like that kind of thing. That kind of thing. So that's another really handy one. And if you're playing in the key of G major, of course, you can use this as your chord 1. So if I do it without on the ocean, it would be like... Then you can use C6/9 as your chord 4, so that's the same as D6/9 was, except you move it down 2 frets. Something like that. So yeah, these 6/9 chords, they sort of have to be used sparingly, but they have a lot of really nice applications, and hopefully you can have some fun playing with those. If we were in the key of G major, our complete range of chords in G major is G major, the main ones are G, C and D, so G major 7 now, or G6-9, C6-9, and for the D chord, recall I said the fifth chord's got to be a dominant, so we're going to use the D9 chord, which is on the list of bossa chords there. We can use D9 as our chord 5. This is a really great chord 5 for general use anyway. The other ones we could use our E minor 9 chord again, because there's an E minor chord in the key of G. While we're here, I'll show you another really useful slidey shape, which I use in the Latin jazz band, but I also use for folk music a lot, which is this one. And this gives you a minor 7 chord, and you can slide it around in order to get the other chords that we want. So for G major, A minor is the second chord, and you'd play that like that. So it's index finger on the 5th fret. You leave the A string open because that's another root note. Then all the others in a line, all on the 5th fret, and then the open E string at the top. And that gives you a really nice A minor substitute, which is an A minor 7. If you slide that up 2 frets, you get a really nice B minor substitute, which is a B minor 11, because it's got an E in it. Basically it's a B minor, it's a jazzy version. So through that you've got a whole kind of super bossa chord scale for G major. G major, G6-9, A minor 7, B minor 11, C6-9, D9, and E minor 9, and we miss out the 7th one because 7th chords are rubbish. So yeah, these 6-9 and 9 and minor 9 voicings are the kind of trademark sound of bossa, and they're super versatile. Let's have a little look at how you could use some of these chord shapes that I've been talking about in other keys. So one place that they're really, really nice is for tunes in E Dorian. In E Dorian, if you use this E minor 9 shape as your chord 1, it's like ultra atmospheric. So I'll demonstrate it with Morrison's jig. So that's going to be my chord 1. My chord 4 in E Dorian would normally be A major. Because E Dorian is related to D major, Dorian's the second mode, so if I count back 1 from E, I get D Ionian, D major. I've got all the same chord options in E Dorian as I would have in D major. So in D major, my 5th chord, which has to be dominant if you're adding tetrads, would have been A7, and so now it's going to be this nice jazzy A13 chord, and that also applies in E Dorian. So that's going to be my 4th chord, is A13, and I'm going to use that B minor shape I talked about before for my 5th chord. So that's going to be, it's B minor 11, isn't it, to give it its proper name, but basically jazzy B minor. So here's how the tune sounds. I'll just do the A part with just those 3 chords. It's a really nice, like, chilled out version of that tune, which is normally a complete stomper, and you can completely change the feel of it by using these nice chords. Another peculiarity of all the modes which aren't Ionian is that when you add tetrads, as well as whichever chord has to be dominant anyway, the 7th chord in the mode also becomes a dominant. So for E Dorian, E is our 1, E minor is our 1 chord. It's the 4th chord in Dorian, which is the one that has to be the dominant. And then the 7th chord in E Dorian would be D major, because E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, C sharp, yes, and then D. D is the 7th one there. So our D chord, when we add tetrads in the key of E Dorian, has to be D7. And this thing about the 7th chord being a dominant, you do this in all the modes except Ionian. So yeah, so for our 7th chord in E, E minor, E Dorian, we're going to use the D9 chord with the flattened 7th in it. So D9 is going to be our 7th chord. Something like that. And I won't go into the other ones too much for now. I'm just going to focus on the sort of very standard bossa-y type progressions. There are lots of other options that go nicely with these. I've talked about them a bit in previous videos, and they're also all available in my book, Backing Guitar Techniques for Traditional Celtic Music, which I know most of you that watch this have. But if you look in the back there, there's a set of chords which work nicely in E Dorian, and you'll find lots of other options there, and also suggestions in chord grids for other things you can do with Morrison's jig. But yeah, so that's the kind of thing that I would do for this tune. So I'll just run through the B part, and I'm going to use E minor 9, D9, A13, and B minor 11 all together for the B part. So something like that. There's all sorts of ways you could use those, but that's just one kind of little demo of it. Let's move on to the last thing that I wanted to talk about in this video, which is the bossa nova love of altered dominant chords. Dominant chords are used generally in places where they're going to resolve down a fifth. So the most common place you would use a dominant chord is as chord 5, and chord 5 resolves back to chord 1, and you all know that marks the ends of sections. It makes people feel like something's finishing. So if you're in a major key, let's go back to an example in G major. If I was doing G and then I played D7, that would sound nice. Wants to go back to G. Especially if I play D major, then I change to D7. That progression really needs G after it, because you've got this kind of instability that's created by adding the flattened 7th. So there's the D note in my D chord, and I put my flattened 7th in, and that's created a lot of instability. It's created a kind of downward movement, and that flattened 7th wants to resolve to the major third of the G chord. So yeah, that's where you commonly use dominant chords, is you use them as chord 5 in a major key, and they come back to chord 1. So like that. As well as that, you can use dominant chords in minor keys. Doesn't work so well in the mixed Lydian mode, because the mixed Lydian mode is an older thing from before the days of equal temperament and functional harmony and all these much more modern musical constructs, and it kind of loses a lot of its traditional sound if you start messing about with these kinds of things. So I wouldn't really recommend it for the mixed Lydian mode, although actually you can sometimes get away with using dominant chords in place of chord 5. but chord 5's meant to be minor in the mixed Lydian mode, and if it isn't, it doesn't really sound as folky, so maybe do that sparingly. But anyway, in the Dorian and the Aeolian, the two minor modes, you can replace chord 5 with a dominant chord sometimes, and sometimes it sounds quite cool. It's a very modern sounding thing to do. It does sound quite good. Simon, if you're still watching, you were asking me recently, I think, about the melodic minor. I think you were asking me recently about the melodic minor anyway. Yeah, I'm 80% sure you asked me about this. Somebody did. If it wasn't you, I'm really sorry. Somebody asked me about it. Anyway, so the melodic minor is this technique where you basically, it's so that in minor keys you can change the 5th chord from being a minor chord to a major chord, and that makes it want to resolve back to chord 1 more, because the major 7th note is more unstable than the flattened 7th note. So I won't go into the theory of that too much, but if I'm playing an E minor and I play E minor, B minor, E minor, that sounds kind of nice as the end of a section. But if I play like that, B major back to E minor, it's got more of a wanting to end kind of sound to it. Oh, it was you. Oh, that's good. Cool. I was beginning to worry I've been muddling students up then, but now it's good. So yeah, that's what the melodic minor is mainly used for. Sorry, not the melodic minor, the harmonic minor, rather. It's used so that you can make the 5 chord in a minor key into a major chord, and it makes it want to resolve back to chord 1. Well, what you can do if you want to enhance that effect is replace that chord with a dominant chord. So if I played B7, going back to E minor, it really wants to go back. Like if I played over Morrison's, you see there, when I add that 7th in, it really kind of wants to go back to the E minor. It doesn't necessarily sound great in the context of that tune, but it's just a kind of demonstration, you know. So you can do that. Sometimes it sounds quite nice. If you do it briefly, you put that B minor, and you convert it into a B7 briefly, then you go back to E minor. It sounds kind of cool. Usually works well in minor keys. So that's the two main things that you're going to use dominant chords for in your folk backing, is for 5/1s basically. Now if you're feeling cheeky and you like jazz, then you can actually replace any chord which is going to be followed up with another chord whose root is down a 5th with a dominant chord. So if I was playing in G major again, and I played a progression like G major, A minor, D major, G major, G major, A minor, D major, G, A to D, A, G, F sharp, E, D, that is down a 5th. So if I go from A to D, and D to G, D, C, B, A, G, that is down a 5th as well. So I could actually replace both of those with dominants if I was feeling really cheeky, but use this sparingly because it's very much a kind of jazz technique, and it might annoy traditionalists. So I might choose to go there's my A7 chord. There's my D7 chord, coming back to my G, which is my chord 1 at the end of the section. And you can see there, when I throw that A7 in, I'm doing it very briefly. I don't want to throw it in for the whole bar. Well, you could do it actually, you could get away with it, but I try and do it briefly just in case it clashes with any of the notes in the tune. In that instance, actually, it doesn't, so it's fine, but yeah. So yeah, anytime you're resolving down a fifth, you can put in a dominant chord. And that leads me back to the last point that I wanted to make, which is about altered dominants. There are two altered dominant chords which crop up really commonly in bossa nova, and I'm going to show you one shape for each of them. And then at the end I'll tell you what an altered dominant chord actually is. I know that's a bit of a back to front way of doing it, but yes. So let's see, which one should we do first? Let's go back to talking about the key of E Dorian, because this is the context in which I like to use them the most. You'll find lots of other places you can use them as well. If we were in E Dorian, our 5-1 is B minor back to E minor. And instead of B minor, I could replace it with B7. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace it for extra tension with an altered dominant chord, which is a dominant chord with an extra note added which really shouldn't be there. Now, the altered notes you can add are a sharp fifth, a flat fifth, and a sharp ninth, which is the same thing as a minor third, or a flat ninth, which is like a flattened second. So for B, if I had a sharp ninth, it would be a semitone above B, which deliberately clashes with B, but it creates lots of tension, and that's going to get resolved by resolving back to my E minor chord. So that's one option. I could have, oh sorry, that's the flat ninth, isn't it? And then the sharp ninth, well the ninth would be C sharp there, because it's one note above B within the scale. And so the sharp ninth is one semitone up again, so that's a D note. So if I add either of those notes to if I make like a B7 bar chord, I could add a flat ninth rather by putting my extra finger there, or I could do it like this with the sharp ninth. Those would both be altered dominant chords because I've deliberately added wrong notes. If I wanted to add a sharp fifth, I would do it using this shape, which is one of the ones I wanted to show you because it's really, really useful. And if I wanted to add a flat fifth, it would be like that. I don't really like that chord, partly because it's hard to play, and partly because I just haven't found many nice places to use it. It's good for other stuff, but not in the context of folk backing, so I'm not going to bother talking about that one. The one I really want to show you though is this. This is a really great chord, and it's on the linked blog. This is called B7 sharp 5. So what I've got my index finger on the B note on the 7th fret of the bottom string. I'm gently muting the A string by resting that index finger on it as well. Then I've got my middle finger on the 7th fret of the D string. That's giving me my flattened 7th. I've got my ring finger on the 8th fret of the G string, and I've got my little finger on the 8th fret of the B string, and that gives me, altogether, I've got root, flattened 7th, major third, so that's giving me my dominant chord, and then I've got my altered note there under my little finger, my sharp 5th. And that resolves really nicely to E minor 9, which is beloved of loads of bossa tunes. They will very often go. That kind of thing. It also works really nicely under Morrison's. That kind of thing. So that's a really useful chord. You can use it as chord 2 in a major key because it resolves then really nicely to chord 5. So if I was playing in G major, I might do something like that's G major 7, or I could use G6 9. Then my A7 sharp 5 sounds a bit grim, lots of tension, but then resolves nicely to D9. So that kind of thing. Yeah, and you can also use it as chord 5 in any minor key. So if you were playing in D minor, you might start out with a D minor bar chord, and you could use the same shape that I talked about before. You just slide it down 2 frets, and that gives you the A version of it, because your index finger's on A on the 5th fret. So that's A7 sharp 5, and it resolves nicely back to D minor. So there's an almost infinite array of possible ways you could use that. If you mess around with it, you'll find loads. The last shape I want to talk about is this one, which some people call the Hendrix chord because it's in things like Purple Haze. But yeah, what this chord is, I'm going to use it as, let's stick to the key of E Dorian because we were talking about it before. So I'm going to use it as chord 5 in the key of E Dorian. So it's going to be a B, basically it's a B7 with an extra note added. And if you remember the 9 shape that we used before, we used it up here for D9. If we move it down here so it's B9, then the little finger is holding down the 9th, and so if I sharpen that 9th by a semitone, I've got a B7 sharp 9. That's a really nice altered dominant to use, and it resolves very nicely back to an E minor 9, or E minor 13, or you know, some equivalent kind of chord. So resolve it back to my E minor 9 back up here. Something like that. So that's another really common bossa chord, and it sounds great. The other thing you can use that for is, again, any time where you're going to resolve down a 5th. So a very common example would be as chord 2 in a major key. So with the B example that I gave there, you might go A major, B minor, to this very tense kind of B7 flat 9 chord, and then you'd resolve down to E, which is your chord 5, and then back to A. So that's a 2-5-1 in A major. Something like that. So I suppose the takeaways from this are, bear in mind with tetrads you can add any extensions so long as the notes that you add are from the scale, and it's really, really good practice to take a very simple shape like this for A7, for example, where you've just got the root, the flattened 7th and the 3rd, and get used to working out where the scale is around that. So find all those notes around it, because you can add any one of those to that chord and it'll sound nice. I love that chord. Any of those kind of things. So that's a really good little exercise. And the other thing is, so with the tetrads you've got chord, if you're in a major key, chord 1's a major 7, chord 4's a major 7, chord 5 always has to be dominant, and 2, 3 and 6 always have to be minor 7s. And then when you move to another mode, if you've got a mode wheel, you squizzle your mode wheel round and you use the equivalents. So with D, for example, D Ionian is related to E Dorian, so you've got all the same tetrads available to you. E minor 7, F sharp minor 7, G has to be major 7, same as before, A is still the dominant 7, but then with the modes that aren't Ionian, the 7th one in whichever mode you're in also becomes a dominant. So that's true for Dorian, Mixed Lydian and Aeolian. But the same thing about these extensions applies, so you can always add any extensions from the right scale. I think that's about everything I wanted to say. Oh, just a very last thing, I was going to tell you what altered dominants actually were. If you think about the notes in a dominant chord, in fact, let's play it. So let's talk about G7. Here's a G major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So to make it from G major 7 into G dominant 7, or just G7 for short, you're flattening that 7th note. So your notes are 1, 3, 5, flat 7. If I add the ninth is the second note, so here are the notes that I'm using so far. I've got the first and the second, it's up an octave, but it's still in there. The third was already in the chord. If I add the 11th note, then that's the 4th. Then the 5th was already in the chord. If I add the 13th, that's the 6th note. My 7th was already in the chord, and then I'm back where I started. So if you play a G13 chord, theoretically it's actually got all the notes of the G scale with the flattened 7th that we're using to build the chord in it. If you then take that 9th and you consider that the flattened 9th or the sharp 9th and the flattened 5th or the sharp 5th are options which you can use to add extra tension to that chord in order to make it want to resolve down a 5th extra hard, that actually covers every single chromatic note apart from the major 7th which exists. And that means that by taking a simple dominant shape like this G7, if you add literally any note at all to that shape, so I can just pick one at random with my little finger and go like that, you're going to get some sort of altered dominant chord, guaranteed. And so long as you resolve to a chord whose root is down a 5th, 90% chance it'll sound fine. So yeah, this kind of seemed utterly mad to me when I first thought about it, but if you take a simple dominant 7 chord, add literally any note you want to it, or any extra notes, those will just add extra tension to it. As long as you resolve down a 5th, it'll probably sound fine, and by just messing about with that idea, you'll probably find loads of cool chords. Cool, so thank you very much to the 8 people who have survived the entire of this massive music theory ramble. I'm sorry it's been a bit technical today, but yeah, thank you all very much for tuning in. Does anyone have any particular questions about anything? How do I clean melted brain out of the carpet? Evidently not. Anyway, I'll add the one extra 6/9 chord voicing that I used with the root on the bottom string. I'll add that to the free blog. The blog is linked at the top of the comments for this. I'll link it again now, just at the bottom, so that it's there at both ends. So if you want to go and look at those chord shapes, they're all there for free. You can download them as well if you want to, do whatever you want to do. They were all made with Theo's chord generator. My friend Theo is a computer genius and a music genius as well. and builds violins and cellos and all sorts. So if you want any cello repairs or violins building or anything like that, he's definitely your man. But check out his chord generator. It's really useful for finding unusual chord voicings, and it also will work with banjos, mandolins. It works with all sorts of different instruments. There's options at the top left to change that. So check that out if you're into finding unusual chords. I've linked that in the box as well. Cool. Right, if no one's got any particular questions about anything, then I will sign off for today and go have some dinner. Next week I'll be back, same time, 5:30 on Friday. I'll be in the shop. Shop's open on Monday. Yvonne, I'll see you there. Yvonne will be opening the shop for me. We're going to do a grand opening ceremony, first customer through the door. Monday at 1 o'clock if anyone's in the area. I think most of you are in the States, so it's probably not very helpful to you guys, but I do mail order as well, but it's a bit slow to America at the moment, obviously, with the global situation. But anyway, yeah, thank you all very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.